Well, good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time as we are continuing to look at our focus about resolution keeping. And today is the memorial of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a priest and angelic doctor of the church. He is the patron saint of Catholic education, philosophers, theologians, scholars, apologists, and Aquinas has an interesting story. So, at 5 years old, he was given over to the Benedictine monastery at Mount Cassien, and as he matured there, he was drawn to Aristotle's Greek philosophy and in a shocking turn of events, ended up leaving the Benedictine order to become a Dominican. And there he finished his studies with Albert the Great, then became a professor in Paris. And Thomas Aquinas saw the entire natural order as coming from God and viewed reason as a divine gift. And so his magnum opus was the Summa Theologia, and it addresses the entirety, basically, of Catholic theology. Yet it went unfinished at the very end, and when he was asked why he didn't finish it, Thomas Aquinas said this, I cannot go on. All that I have written seems to me like so much straw compared to what I have seen and what has been revealed to me. And what I gathered from this is that somewhere along the way, he encountered Christ in such a way that all the writing and all the arguing over the minutiae and the details of all this stuff just really wasn't fulfilling to him anymore. And that's very interesting considering our resolution keeper focus this week is making our resolutions fulfilling. So that got me to thinking, right? How fulfilling is our resolution or our resolutions? How fulfilling are they? Now, for the past several weeks, I have been using the resolution to love more as my example because that's my resolution. And I love this resolution. I believe it's a resolution that will help anyone that chooses it to draw closer to God because God is love. And so I'd like to once again maybe look to our readings to look for help with our theme of fulfilling resolutions. And I want to do this understanding that the patron saint of theologians at a certain point in his life decided that his massive undertaking, which was almost complete, was something that needed to be set aside. Because through his own experiential relationship with God, it had lost its appeal and become unfulfilling. And interesting enough, in our scripture from Hebrews, we see that God has also changed how he relates to humanity. So apparently the way that God related to humanity was not so fulfilling after a while. And see, there was a time in Israel's past when everything related to God centered around offerings and sacrifice and the temple structure and the Sadducees. And there were all these laws, and the way people drew closer to God was through strict adherence to all these laws and ordinances and traditions. And that carried through after the Babylonian captivity, and all these traditions and all these rules were, even expanded because they couldn't go to the temple anymore. So they really lent into their whole sense of holiness was built around these laws and keeping them. And when those laws were violated, they brought offerings and sacrifices, and in this way, over time, people stopped, I think, caring about having a personal relationship with their Creator. And we're just going through this rote process of kind of bringing offerings and sacrifices to the temple and began this very transactional relationship with God instead of a relational relationship with God. And that kind of reminded me, right, in Hebrews 10, 8 through 10, how God changed all that. Okay, so God kind of got tired of that. It was not fulfilling from his perspective anymore. And we read this. Christ said, sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings, you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, though they were offered in accordance with the law. Then he said, here I am, I have come to do your will. He sets aside the first to establish the second, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus once and for all. So there came a time, right, when God himself looked at his own covenant and said, this has lost its effectiveness. It's time to change it up and to do something to bring the people out of this impersonal kind of transactional situation and into living relationship. The people need to see how much I love them, so forth and so on. And so he sets aside that whole first bit and says to establish the second, to make it more fulfilling, he sent his own son, right? And how God went about changing, from the law with all its sacrifices and offerings to a relationship through Christ is kind of miraculous. And that change, totally shifted the depth of relationship and fulfillment of being a child of God. Because when we can experience relationship and union with the divine through Christ versus through some transactional adherence to rules, which becomes very dry, then our relationship kind of goes from this dry thing to something very alive and powerful and personal, and that's very important, right? So let's just kind of apply that to our resolution, shall we? Now, my resolution was to love more. Now, if that has gotten stale, or if your resolution, whatever it was, has gotten stale, then I think, like these scriptures suggest, we need to ask ourselves, how can we re-enliven that resolution again? I mean, God did not give up his desire to want to be in fellowship with humanity. He just changed the way he went about it. So maybe our resolution by this time, who knows, maybe it's gotten a little stale, but we don't want to change our resolution. We want to re-enliven it. So how can we infuse new energy into it? That's kind of the question. And in our readings today, we see that God is much more concerned with us, walking with him in relationship than in us bringing our offerings and sacrifices to him out of some dead routine with no, relational investment. So how do we see this relational investment contrasted to blindly bringing offerings and sacrifices? Well, I think we see it in the authentic desire not to bring offerings and sacrifices to check some box, but rather in an authentic desire to be a vessel of God's will, to enter into relationship with the divine through Christ, and then partner with him in loving the world. I think that is huge. And that's a big piece of relationally entering into this new covenant, that law of love. And so I love where we read in Mark 3:33 through 35, and Jesus answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother, right? So how about us? Does our relationship with God drive us to want to walk in his will? And are we seeking that union through Christ? Or are we just kind of checking the box of going to Mass, when it's time, getting those masses of obligation, drudging ourselves in for confession, all that? I mean, religion can be a very stale thing. But a living relationship with God where you're opening yourself up to partner with him, that's a totally different type of relationship and way of, reacting and responding to God. So, for us, I think our application, if we're going to apply this, is a couple questions, right? One is, how might being in God's will help our resolutions be more fulfilling? Not on God's will, but how might being in God's will help our resolutions be more fulfilling? And then two, what might we need to change up for our resolution to find new life? And I think that's a question you need to answer, but think in terms of how can you liven up your resolution. Take it out of some stale thing, and make it something that's alive and personal. How can you do that, right? Well, thank you for joining me today as we have looked at the resolution keepers making our resolution fulfilling. Join me next week and we'll go into this a little bit.